Hello and welcome to part 3 of my AP Lang summer assignment vlog on All My Sons by Arthur Miller. This third quarter of the book I think gives a lot more insight into the characters and just kind of how they actually feel about each other, what they're really thinking, who they are. There's a part where Annie is talking to Sue, the neighbor, and Sue's saying like, well, once you guys get married, like there's one thing you can do for me. And it's like, oh yeah, if I can do it, of course. And she's like, move away, go somewhere else. And starts talking about how with Chris around, Sue's husband Jim just like can't be satisfied with his job. He always feels like because he's not giving up everything in his life to go do medical research, everything's just meaningless and he's not fulfilling his duty. And Sue very much resents Chris for the way that he makes her husband feel. And when Chris comes back and then he and Annie are talking and she's like, do you realize that these people despise you? Just because you like everybody doesn't mean that everyone likes you. And Chris is like, no, what are you talking about? He doesn't know. He doesn't understand because no one says things directly to the Keller family. They just talk behind their backs and just don't like them. It doesn't seem like they're as popular as everyone pretends they are. We also meet George for the first time in this scene 2. When he first arrives, Jim, who drove him to the house, doesn't even want him to get out of the car at first because he's like, he's just gonna upset everybody, he's just kind of in a fury right now. Annie, you should go talk to your brother and calm him down before he makes everything worse. And then eventually George does come in and he and Chris start arguing because George is saying it's all Keller's fault because Keller just refuted everything that Annie and George's father was saying in court and made it sound like the whole thing with the cracked cylinder heads was completely on their father and, you know, Keller had nothing to do with it. He didn't even know. And George very much resents that and is like, Annie, you can't marry Chris. His father ruined our family. So he's trying to confront Chris about it and Chris is like, no, why are you blaming my father for all of this? You heard his testimony in court. He didn't do that. And he doesn't believe it, and he doesn't want to believe it. George wants Annie to go home with him when he leaves later that night because he doesn't want her to have any more to do with the Keller family. And she's like, no, I'm not going home with you. And Chris is like, no, she's not going home with you because they want to get married. And they don't want either Mrs. Keller or George or anyone to stop them from that. George and Mrs. Keller actually get along pretty well, though. He seems to like her and, remember her from his days as a child when he lived right next door. She, remembers that his favorite drink is grape juice, and she's fawning over him when he comes, oh, they're making you so old, you look all gray. You know, oh, Annie, why didn't you feed him, etc. And George, I think, appreciates that and likes the attention he's getting because I don't think he gets as much of that at home. Also, Lydia, Frank's wife, seems to have a connection with George from back when he lived there because, they're very happy to see each other, and then when he finds out that, she already has 3 children and stuff, he's, a little bit hurt by it, and she's kind of embarrassed, you've been gone for so long, Georgie. And he says, yes, I'm starting to realize apparently the reason Frank is so superstitious and believes in horoscopes and that everything that matters is when you were born, because when he was born he was always a year ahead of the draft, so he never had to leave to go to war or anything, which is probably a big part of why Lydia ended up with him. To sort of warm George up to the Kellers, once he gets there, Joe has said to Chris that oh, well, why don't you ask him to stay here? I know some lawyers in town, I can set him up because George works in the law somewhere and wants to be all encouraging to him, welcoming, friendly, so that George understands that there's no hard feelings between these families, at least from the Kellers' side. And Mother and Chris and Annie are kind of proposing that idea to George, but as soon as Keller actually comes out of the house and sees him and tries to talk to him, George is once again kind of wary and serious. He's polite, but he obviously doesn't really want to be around Keller much. Still definitely is holding something against him. I do really like how Arthur Miller weaves kind of the relations and conversations between the characters together, though. It's just really believable, and he offers so much kind of insight. You get to know the characters just by reading a few pages of them having a conversation. After talking for a while, Keller and George are starting to warm up to each other, but then something is said that just makes it sound the least bit like there could be something suspicious that happened that night with the cylinder heads, and that maybe Keller was involved with that, and things get very tense again. When Mother finally finds out, probably not in the best way, that Annie and Chris intend on marrying, I mean, she knew, but she hadn't been told yet, and she's very adamant, like, Annie needs to go. She was your brother's girl, you're not marrying her. And then she says, your brother's alive because if he's dead, your father killed him. So she knows that something's not right. She knows that Keller holds some responsibility for what happened, and Chris is just kind of taken by complete surprise. He's just in shock. He's like, what do you mean? And then he and Keller have a long chat, which we will talk about in the next vlog. So, thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe. Goodbye!